Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. In this video, we'll cover some of the differences between Flask and Django, how we can go about creating a Flask application, and some solutions on how we can host them. Let's jump right in. So let's talk about some of the core differences between Flask and Django for just a moment. Flask has a very minimalist approach to it, while Django has a lot of stuff included whenever you create a Django project. Flask, being minimalist, just has all the core stuff you need to create an application. And that's why a lot of people use Flask for creating something called microservices. However, there's no reason why you cannot create large applications with Flask. Just a lot of the components that you'll need in creating those large applications, you'll either have to find on GitHub repositories created by someone else or create them yourself. Meanwhile, Django already has a lot of the stuff built into it, and you can just use it as you're creating your larger applications. A good description from a Reddit user on this is that let's say that your final goal is to hit 50. With Flask, you start at 0 and you build up to 50. With Django, you start at 100 and you strip away stuff until you get to 50. With this in mind, it means that Flask is a lot more flexible to do as you please with it. So as you're building these components, you have complete control to create exactly what you want, which can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. With Django, those pieces are already built, so you're following best practices on how to do something. With any programming application, customization is a good thing and a bad thing. The more custom it gets, the harder it is to maintain generally, and it's tougher to bring people onto your team that can understand the project very simply. Meanwhile, if you're just following best practices, you can easily bring someone on, have them go through a walkthrough, and pretty much understand your application from the get-go. So it all depends on what you want, and there's no wrong answer in which one you choose to learn. However, in my opinion, I think it is better to start from 0 and then build pieces so that you can understand what's going on the back end of these applications. So my suggestion is to start with Flask, and then once you have an understanding of how Flask works, then maybe move on to Django, and then once you understand both, pick the one that's best for your project that you're working on. Now that we've talked about the differences between Django and Flask, let's now go into the creation of a Flask application. Our first step will be to install certain dependencies that we need for our Flask app. If we want to install dependencies only into a certain environment, that way we can activate and deactivate that environment, then we'll want to use a library called virtualenv. To get that library, what we'll say is pip3 install, and it's virtualenv. We'll execute this. You see that mine is already installed, but if yours is not, then it will install it here. Now, to create a virtual environment, we'll execute it using a Python statement. We'll make virtual env, and then we'll name our environment. The standard here is just to say env, and we'll create that virtual environment within the same file that we're working in. You see that we now have this folder over here to the left that says env. And what this is just an environment that we can make sure has all the right dependencies within it, so we're not using different dependencies on different machines. We can just activate this environment and use loaded libraries that we put into that environment. So to activate that environment, we will call it. So it is named env. It is in this env folder. So env, there's a subdirectory called scripts and activate. You see that we get an unauthorized on my machine. You might get this as well. There's a command that we can run in our terminal, and this will be linked down below too. So I will set my execution policy and I will run this again. Now you see in my terminal that it is prefixed with this parentheses env to the left. That means we're working inside of that environment that we just created. Creating environments to work in projects like this one is a good practice. You don't have to do it, but it's a good thing to do. All right, so now that we have that environment active, let's say pip install Flask. And this will install the Flask library into our environment that we're using. That is now all the dependencies we need for this tutorial, since it's just a Flask tutorial. Since we want to use that library, we'll say from Flask import capital Flask. Then we might want a few other things later on in this tutorial. Don't worry if you don't understand these yet. I'll talk through them later. But we'll want to import request, and we'll do render template. So each of those will allow us to do different functionality within our Flask application. We'll initialize our app by using that capital import of Flask, and this will just be name. Now let's talk about something called routes. A route within a Flask application is just a URL path that the user can go to access the information that you provide in a function. That sounds like a lot, but let's talk through it as we create one. We have a decorated app, and what this will be is route. All we're saying is let's create a route in our app, and we can denote the route to go to. So if we don't want anything else, let's say we want a home page, we can just leave this blank like this. So now when the user goes to the home page, the function that we put directly below this will be returned to the user. So that can be a HTML page, it can be logic, or it can be something else. So to create that function, just like all functions in Python, we'll say def, we'll call it something like home, and now we can put the logic to return to the user here. So if we want to return some content to the user, we can say something like return, and then we can just pass a string. The way that Flask works is if we return a string, it is HTML code by default. So we can say home page, and we'll hit save, make sure this is working. And just like that, we have created our first page within our Flask application. So if we want to view this, we can say Flask Run, and this will run a development server at this URL. Since we have created our home page, we just need to go to this URL. I will execute it. You see that we get a 200 where I went to it on a different monitor here. We already have our first homepage created within Flask. So here's our homepage at the URL. You see if we go to something different that we get a 404 not found. That's because we haven't created a route corresponding to this URL. So if we created home in this app route, we would have content on this page. So now that we know how to do static routing, which just means that we can put in some string here and go to that same string within a web page, let's talk about something called variable routing. So sometimes when a user goes to a web page, we don't want to just return static content. Instead, we might want a URL that follows the same format that can return different content depending on certain specific criteria put into that URL. So let's say that we're creating a site that has many different articles on it. Within these articles, we might have article 1, 2, 3, 4, but we don't want to create static pages for each one of those articles. Instead, we can create logic to return a specific one and have variable routing give that to the user. So within variable routing, we will do the same thing. We will denote that we're creating a route. And here, what we can do is, let's say we're creating a page called articles. And now we can use these brackets and put in a certain criteria for this variable routing. Let's say that we're expecting an integer for an article number. So we can say int article number. And what this is saying is that when a user goes to the URL /articles/2, we're going to give the information for 2. But when they go to articles/3, we're going to give the information for the third article. So now the same way that we did it before, we'll say some function, we'll do show article. And since this is a function that will be taking in a variable from our endpoint, then we'll need to make sure that we pass that to the function that is doing the processing of that request. So we name it here. I will call it the same thing just to keep it simple, article number. And at this point, we would do our logic to return specific content. We don't have that content. So what I will do instead is I will do what the walkthrough of Flask does, and I will just return. We'll create a f string. This is just a way that we can put certain information into a Python string. We'll say article, and we will do article number. So that way, when the user goes to this URL, we will just return the same number that the user passes. We'll make sure that we have that leading slash. And to show you that, we will run this again. I will pull over this page and we will work with it. So articles was our URL. And now let's put in some number. We'll put in 90. So this returns article 90. Our logic could return the actual content, but I just want to show you how we can start using variables within the URL to create Flask applications. So far, I've only shown you how to return information back to the user if they just visit the site. But a lot of Flask applications are developed in a way that we send them different types of requests and they process those requests to send us back the correct information in the right format. So that sounds like a lot, but right now we're sending something called a GET request to each one of these endpoints. And that's just saying, give me the information. A user might want to send a different type of request, such as a post to get information from a database or to send information to be posted on the website. So I will show you how to create those. What we'll do is we'll say app.route the same way we have before. And let's say there is an endpoint that we want to send information to do something with. A common one of these is called login. And if we want to accept a post request, we'll say a keyword argument of methods, and we'll take in a list. This will be get and post. So at our login URL, we'll accept a get request, the same thing we've been sending before, and a post request. To show you what we do with those, we'll create a login function. And now if you remember that import we did of request at the very beginning, we can say something like request.method, and this will give us the method that the user uses to access that URL. We can check for equality by using == in Python and say something like get. One way to do this is to say if request.method equals get, then we can just return some string. So login page. Then we can say if request.method equals post, then we can try to get information that the user might have sent in the request. Of course, we haven't built this login page, but if we had, then we might do something like request.form and get those values. This will give us the information if a user submits a form, or request.args. This is less standard for a login, but it is information that the user can send in a post request. The specifics on how to create a login form we can cover in a different video, but all that's important for this one is that we know that we can get information from the user and use it in the logic of our Flask application. Now that we've covered some of the basics, let's talk about how we might actually go about creating a multi-page Flask application. We have one more import that we did of render template at the very beginning. What that render template does is allows us to return HTML content in the form of a template to the user. So that is to say, we can return a full-blown web page instead of just strings within our app.py. So if we wanted to create one more page, we'll say route. We'll just say something easy like hello and make sure we have the leading slash. We'll create a function, hello, and what we'll do is return content to the user. That content will be a method to render template, and we'll put in the template name. We'll say hello.html, and we'll need to create this template. The way that templating works within Flask is we'll need to create a new file, a new folder called templates. And within that, we'll have to put in this file name. Since we named it hello.html, we'll do the same thing, and we'll say h1 from hello.html. Of course, this is pretty basic, and you can imagine that you have much more going on in your HTML file, such as CSS, JavaScript, and anything else you want to put in it. But now that we have all of this, let's go and visit our brand new template. So pulling over our web page, we'll go to hello and from hello.html. You see in our terminal, what this is actually doing is sending us that GET request, and we're pulling hello from our templates. Awesome. So that's pretty much the basics on how we can start creating a Flask app. Unfortunately, at this point, you cannot visit this page because I'm hosting it on my local machine. However, there's a few solutions on how we can get this hosted very quickly. One of those solutions to get this hosted very quickly is we can use a service called Wastegurt. And inside Wastegurt, we can create a workspace. So we'll create that. A workspace just allows us to build applications within it. A layer is just one of those applications that comes with a full-fledged environment. So we'll create that layer, which will also create that environment. And to get this hosted, all we have to do is to pull in the files that we need. So we'll drag and drop those. It will upload these. Since Wastegurt comes with an environment, we don't need to pull in our environment. We can just create that environment on Wastegurt. So we have those pulled in. And now to do all the hosting, all we have to do is use a .trigger within Wastegurt to get this working. So .trigger new trigger, we will deploy it, and we have a little bit different of a Flask Run command here. We'll have to denote a argument of port, and we'll say host 0.0.0.0. So I will post this in the description just in case you need it. But now that we have that, we'll make sure that our port matches, and we can click on test. So once we click on test, what this is doing is allowing us to test our new endpoint at a URL which is provided to us, and you see that we get our home page. So that's one quick way that we can host this. We could also host this through other services such as Heroku. It is a little bit more involved because what we would have to do is create a GitHub repository of our code, which we probably should do anyways. And then we can create an automatic pipeline to host on Heroku. I will not do that in this video, but if you are interested in that, please let me know and I'll create a video just to show you how to do that. So if you have any questions or comments, please let me know and I'll be happy to answer them down below. All the information that I said will be in the description is down there, so go and check that out if you need any help whatsoever. And I'll catch you guys next time. See ya.